Hello there my lovely jewelry makers, I'm Christina at CSLdesigns, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this hollow braid wire Kumihimo necklace. Now you can achieve many different looks depending on the materials that you use, whether it's chunky and statement or more fine and elegant. So you can completely customize it to your own personal style. Now if you want to check out more wire Kumihimo designs, I have a book full of them. So I'm going to leave a link to that in the description box down below so you can check that out. And if you want to support me in any way, you can of course like, share and subscribe. Feel free to check out my channel where I have loads of tutorials within many different mediums. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can always become a member of my channel or Patreon and get things like early access, exclusive content and more. Otherwise, if you want to learn how to make this necklace, then keep watching. So these are the materials that we're going to need. Now the wire that I'm using in this case is an aluminium wire and it's got a lovely hammered texture to it. It is approximately 2mm thick, but you can really use any wire that you want to for this design. So regular round wire, I would recommend going thinner than 2mm, or you could even twist two lengths of thinner gauge wire together. For instance, two lengths of 0.4mm would technically then turn into a 0.8mm. Regardless what wire you use, I do recommend that it's on the softer side. It's just much easier to work with and make the braid. We'll then need the wire that's going to run through the inside of the braid and basically hold the beads. And for that I'm using a 1mm regular round wire. You could also use something like a 0.8, just make sure it's not too thin so it has the strength to hold everything. But of course you need it to be able to fit through the holes in the beads. Now as for the beads, I'm using these 6mm blue coated hematite gemstone rounds. Of course you can choose whatever you want to, just make sure, like I said, that the wire running through the braid is going to be able to go through the holes in the beads. Now to finish off the ends of the braid, I'm going to use these bell-shaped ends that are hollow for the braid to go into and have a hole so we can feed the wire through. And then as for the findings, I'm using a lobster claw clasp and extender chain and a few jump rings to put it all together. You can of course choose whatever kind of clasp you prefer. Now as for the tools, we of course need a pair of flush cutters so we can cut our wire, chain nose and tweezer nose pliers to help manipulate the wire and for the jump rings. And then I've got 6-step bell making pliers for the loops we need to make. You can of course use round nose pliers for this. Now of course also and most importantly we'll need a Kumihimo disc, so I'm using the round mini disc in this case to be able to make a round hollow braid. Along with the Kumihimo disc we then also need some kind of rod to help make the hollow braid. In this case I'm just using a random rod from a tool I have, but I highly recommend something like a wooden dowel. You can also get those in specific measurements, because for instance you want the rod to match up with your beads. Because of course after we make the braid, the beads will need to be able to go inside. So have your rod be approximately the same size or a bit larger than the size of your beads. I then highly recommend using something like electrical tape that will help hold all the wires together and make it more manageable as we start out. And I also prefer to use something like these finger protectors. It's going to help prevent calluses from where the wire is going to be rubbing on your fingers while we're making the braid. Now you're going to be able to find the full tool and material list in the description box down below, along with useful links. Otherwise, let's get it all ready and let's get started. Then the length of wires we'll need to cut is 8 lengths of the wire that we're using for the braid of about 40 centimeters each, and just make sure it's nice and straight so there's no obvious kinks or bends in it. And then we need a length of the wire that's going to go through the braid and holding the beads of about 30 centimeters. Now the first thing we need to do is get all our lengths of wire we're going to use for the braid attached to our rod. So I have those handy, and for that I'm then going to use some tape. So I'm just going to take a fairly long piece here, just so it's easier to work with. And I'm going to start attaching it to my rod just towards one end. Now in this case mine has this thing on the end, kind of a blockage here, but now that I have the tape ready, I'm going to start grabbing my wires, and I'm just going to start with one at a time. Now because my rod has this kind of blockage on the end, I'm going to kind of just pre-bend my wires. If yours is just straight all the way, don't worry about this. But I'm just going to bend towards the end of the wire. Just put a little bit of about 90 degrees or so, and then place it. And then I'm going to take my tape and bring it over to basically fasten it in place, and then I'm just going to bring the wire further up. So you could just do that straight away as opposed to the pre-bending part if you don't have this blockage on the end, but that's what I have available. And basically what I'm going to do is repeat this with all the wires. So in my case I'm just pre-bending it, so it will fit up against the blockage here on the end, and then bring the tape over it. And I'm just gonna bend it further, and the reason that I'm bending the wires like this is so that when we start making the braid here, they don't just pull through the tape. So it'll be much easier if we don't have to worry about that part. So just keep going around, and this is why I said get a fairly long length of tape. If you run out, you can always just add a new length. But I'm just going to gradually add a length of wire at a time. And then just bend them back there. And just do this until all the lengths are attached with the tape here onto your rod. So I've now attached all the lengths here just in that same way, and don't worry about it looking messy, because especially with these chunky wires it's going to look extra messy, but just distribute them as evenly as possible, and you don't have to worry about it being perfect or anything, because this is just the starting point and we can always cut anything off that looks a little bit too messy. So from here we are ready to then add this to our disc. So I'm just going to put this end where I have my tape, that's going to be the starting point, down through the center of the disc, and then we need to distribute these wires out on the disc so we can start braiding. And now of course the rod is just going to keep sticking straight up here because that's what we're going to be braiding around, but to distribute the wires I'm literally going to just use the quarters of the disc. So I'm going to get 2 wires up to sit around the number 1, so 1 on either side, like that, and then we want 2 on either side of, in my case here it's 25, like that, and then we want 2 directly opposite both of these pairs, and just grab whatever wires are closest to these slots here, and the last 2 are going to go on either side of number 9. So there we go, this is going to be the setup, and we're going to get straight on with making the braid. We're not going to add beads until after we've made the braid completely. So what I'm going to do is every time we start a round, I'm going to start from the top here, so the wires around number 1, and it doesn't matter what side you start with as long as you keep staying consistent throughout. I'm going to take the top right one there to begin with, and then I'm going to go over towards the left, so the top right one goes towards the left, and then what I'm making sure to do is that my wires are going to get nice and tight close around the rod here in the middle. So put a little bit of strength into it. Now what we're going to do is stop before the next pair here and then place it into that slot just before it, and then grab the top one of this pair on the side, so the very next wire, I'm going to bring that, continue in the same direction around the circle, around the disc, and bring it around, stop before the next pair, place it into the slot that's just before that pair, and then grab the very next wire, and just swap hands whenever you need to, what's most comfortable to hold on to. And then that next wire we released, we bring that over, continue in that, in this case, counterclockwise motion, and then place it into the slot just before the next pair. And finally, with the final pair there, do the same thing. So grab, in this case, the bottom one of the pair on the side, obviously not including the one we just placed there, over and up, and this time I'm going to just place it into the empty slot on the top that we freed out when we started making these movements, and that is one rotation all the way around the disc. Now what we're going to do is the same thing but in the opposite direction. So I'm just going to hold on to my disc like this and then release the top left wire and bring it over towards the right. So in this case I'm now going in a clockwise motion, and then I'm going to stop before the next pair, which now has a slot in between, but it still counts as the next pair as they were originally positioned on the disc. Now place it into the slot before it, and then grab the next wire, the very next one, jump over the next wire that we run into there, but then the next pair that we run into, place the wire before that pair, just like we did in the first round, going counterclockwise. Like I said, we're doing the same thing, but going clockwise now. Release the next wire, jump over, and then place it into the slot before the next pair. And then repeat with the last one, release it, bring it up, and now I'm just going to place it in the empty slot on the top. So the top pair here is already positioned correctly for the next round. Now you'll find the rest of them have now got a gap in between them. So all we need to do is close them up so they move one step closer to each other. You can see that's now become a pair again. And just do the same with all the others around. So the bottom one, and then the side one. And then we have all our wires back in the original setup with having pairs on all quarters of the disc. And this is basically all there is to the braid itself. You want to keep repeating this thing over and over again. So, and this is where I said, make sure you always start with the same side. Even if you start it with the left one as opposed to the right one as I'm doing, you just want to make sure you keep starting with that one. So I'm going to start with the right one because that's what I did the first time. Now just make sure as well that we are pushing our wires as close and tight against the rod here in the middle as possible to get a nice uniform braid, but then bring it over, in this case in the counterclockwise direction. Again, place it into the slot before the next pair, release the very next wire, jump over and bring it into the slot before the next pair. Swap hands whenever you need to, and then release that next wire, jump over, and I like to, as I go as well, keep smoothing out my wires here, so when we get further down to where the braid is getting formed, the wire is in, you could say, as nice condition as possible. Place that into the slot before the next pair, and finally the pair on the side here, jump over, bring up to the top, and this time just place it into the empty slot on the top there. Now going in the opposite direction, take the left of the top ones, jump over, now in the clockwise motion, place it into the slot before the next pair, grab that very next wire, jump over, and place it into the slot before the next pair, and then just carry on with the rest of them. And I always like to kind of just push my wires here against the rod, making sure they're as nice and tight as possible. Otherwise, carry on, grab the very next wire there, bring it up to the top, and then place it so we have the top pair ready already, and then the rest of them we can just move one slot closer together. So they become like the original setup. And like I said, you just want to keep going like this, repeat round after round, and create that braid, and it will gradually grow up along the rod here, and you can then also see it forming underneath, and it'll be coming out underneath the disc. So now further along here, first of all you can see what the braid looks like. We get this lovely uniform look. And I just wanted to show you again, give you a little tip of how I feel to do it best and make it nice and uniform and tight around your rod in the middle. So I'm doing the next round here. I've already gone counterclockwise, but I need to go the other way. So to make sure your braid doesn't just kind of grow outward, you want to keep it tight around the rod. You want to make sure that you take the first wire here, release it, and then you want to pull it up and push it tight against the rod as you're moving it to the next slot there, and do that with all of them. So that's kind of how you want to help make it more tight around that rod. and get that more uniform look. And I also always throughout, I'm basically pulling down on the rod here underneath while I'm moving my wires and kind of pushing up against the disc, again to help it move along and build the braid in height as well, of course, or length, or however you want to look at it. But like here, I'm just making sure that I'm pushing against the wires that are actually close to that rod before I then put it in the slot and then carry on to the next one. And that is then how you want to make sure to get it as nice and tight and uniform as possible. And of course, just bring in the wires one slot closer to each other. And then that's another round. So that's just a little tip or two on how to get the best result. So now I made my length of braid here and I've run out of space on the rod. I also don't have much length of the wires left anyway. But what I'm going to do is remove my wires from the disc, because this is plenty. What I personally like to do is basically make a pretty decent length of braid, more than I'm going to need, because you can always cut off ends, trim it down if you need to. If you say maybe have it in the beginning, you have a bit of a messy end. You can see here, I think I made a mistake somewhere, but you can just kind of cut that away if you make it longer than you actually need the final piece to be, and just basically choose the nicest part of the braid to use. So what we need to do now is first of all remove this rod. So the way I'm going to do that is get my cutters and literally just cut off the wires right after the tape. Don't want to be faffing around with untaping it and everything. So I'm just cutting each wire as close to the tape as possible. And I think that's it. And then we should be able to slide off the braid. And you can of course then just remove this at some point. But we then have our final braid here. And then what I like to do is basically kind of finish off one end more or less, and then also start adding the beads before we then finish off the other end, because to add the beads we do need to have at least one end open so we can obviously feed them down through there. Now if you want to just make it a little bit easier to deal with, we can also get rid of the long lengths left here, just so we don't accidentally poke ourselves in the eye or anything. So just cut them down. So something a bit like that. We have a bit of a neater end. And then what we basically want is for this end to also be able to fit inside of the little bell-shaped ends. Now in this case, obviously because I'm using such a thick gauge wire, this is a little small for it. It would fit more easily if you're using 1mm or 0.8mm, or a twisted wire, maybe two lengths of the 0.4mm together. But what we want to do is start to kind of bring them in a little bit. Also, of course, we want to make sure the ends are going to be secure. So because we have the wire running all the way down through the braids, don't worry about anything coming undone by itself. We literally just want it to be able to fit inside of that bell-shaped end. So I'm basically kind of just shaping all the ends here so they kind of stick away from the end, but also go a bit more inwards in a taper. Because like I said, we want to make sure that all these ends can fit inside of there. And it's going to of course be nice and secure, but also look nice. So let's have a little look and see what it seems like. That actually isn't too bad, because we're kind of tapering off the end, and then that will just cap off the ends of the wire, so they're not going to catch or scratch on any skin, of course, while we're wearing it, or clothes for that matter. So that actually will fit. Now to secure this, this is where we then need to get our other length of just plain regular round wire. So this is the one that's going to run through the whole piece and also carry the beads. Now what I'm going to do is, before we use it, I'm going to make a wrapped loop on one end. So you just want to do that in the regular way. I'm going to place my pliers, make about a 90-degree bend, and then I take my 6-step bell making pliers, and I'm just going to use the smallest loop so they don't get too big. Of course you can use round nose pliers for this. Place that on the bend and then bring the tail back around itself all the way around so we form a full circle like that. And then from there I like to put my pliers back onto that circle so it holds its shape while I take this little tail and then wrap it around underneath the circle to secure it in place. And just make sure that the wraps are nice and tight so it all looks nice and neat. If you need to, you can tighten things up with your pliers. And then I'm going to go in and cut off the excess. Get rid of that. And just always make sure to squeeze down that very end of wire so we can't feel it with a finger. So again, it's not going to catch or scratch on skin or clothes. Now from here, we can start to assemble things. So first of all, I'm grabbing one of my bell-shaped ends and I'm going to put this wire through the end from the outside and then coming out on the inside there, and just push that all the way down. And then I'm going to add my braid, and I'm just putting this length of wire literally through in the center at the very end, so just the end that we kind of prepped already, and just come all the way through to the other end there, making sure it doesn't accidentally catch any of the wires throughout. And then just double check, make sure you're happy with everything before we finalize anything. So I think that's pretty good. It's gonna finish off the end nicely. And now this is where we can start adding our beads. So I haven't cut off this end yet, so we can always trim that down once we're happy with it. But basically, you now just want to add your beads, just one at a time, onto the wire that's running through the center, and then they're gonna slide all the way down. Of course, you can either use pliers to help encourage them if they get a little bit stuck, or just keep adding more beads and they should help each other slide all the way down. And of course, use gravity to your advantage. Have them slide all the way down to the bottom there, so we make sure there's not a gap that you can see anywhere. So you then just want to add however many beads you want to. So I'm now happy with the amount of beads that I've added there, and it's going to be a nice length. So we need to cut off the excess. Now what I'm going to do is cut just a little bit past the bead, because if you notice on the bottom there, you can actually see the very first bead, and of course we have the length of the wires that end up going inside of that bell-shaped end. So just take all that into account, and then I'm gonna cut off the excess of the braid here. Now what I like to do is maybe cut a bit less than what I need, because if you cut too much you obviously can't add more. You'll have to make do with what you've got, but if you cut too little you can always cut off more. So I'm going to cut here first, just go through one wire at a time, and then I think I have the last one like that. And then you can see we can just remove it, and even this short length won't just come undone. You can literally manipulate it, and because they're all woven together in that braid, it's nice and secure still. Now on the end here, I want to make sure before I finish anything off that I keep having the other end nice and tucked up to how I want it to sit, so we don't want it to end up being loose and then we finish off the other end and it turns out the first end we made there has gone a little bit wonky or loose. So try and keep that as tight as possible while we finish off this one. So what we want to do is again get the ends of the braid here. In my case I need to make them a bit smaller than what the bell-shaped end is, so they'll fit inside. But of course, if the end just fits on top of your braid, you can literally just add it. But it all depends on the materials that you're using. So I'm just going to basically taper the end in a bit. Like I said, if you don't need to do that, that's perfect. You can just skip straight to the next step. So try and see what that looks like. So I'm just going to add the bell-shaped end. Now I'm going through from the inside and then through to the outside there, and then push it all the way down. And I'm just making sure to pull the wire tight so I can get a good impression of what the final thing would look like. Now here I can see there's a bit too much of a gap still, so I actually need to cut off a bit more length from the wires. So I would rather like to do that though than say I end up cutting off too much in the first place, because you can always trim a bit more if you need to. So you basically just want to adjust this until you end up with how you want your end to look. So I think I'm pretty much there with the end now, and then just add that bell-shaped end and it fits nicely. I'm pretty happy with that. Now before I finish off the end, I like to basically give it a bit of shape as well, because things can change a bit as you do that. So I'm just going to add a bit of a curve into it instead of it basically being straight like this. So just basically take your time and gently add a curve that's going to then end up laying nicely on the neckline. So we have something a bit more like this, a nice little smile. So all that's left to do is finish off the open end here, and that's going to also then secure everything else in place. So all I'm going to do is a wrapped loop just like we did in the beginning on the other end. Now I'm going to place my pliers just a little bit above where that bell-shaped end is and make sure everything is pushed nice and tight together so we don't end up with any gaps afterwards. Place your pliers, put a bend into the wire, and then I'm going to grab my 6 double making pliers, place them on the bend to create that circle, all the way around your pliers, and then to finish it off I'm gonna grab onto it with my pliers and then fill in that little gap underneath the circle, so between the circle and then that bell-shaped end. And this is then the part that's going to make it nice and tight. You want to then wrap until you basically meet up with the bell-shaped end there, and you can then tell nothing is going to be moving around and be loose. So this basically tightens it all in place. And then when you're done, you can just go in and cut off the excess. And like always, just make sure to squeeze down that very end of the wire so it doesn't catch or scratch on anything. And there we go. So there we now have our necklace done. Of course, we then just need to attach whatever chain that we want to add to the ends here. So either a pre-made chain or you could even make your own. So that is how you make this hollow braid wire Kumihimo necklace. And you can really end up with many different looks depending on the materials that you use. So like the one I made in the tutorial is quite chunky and a statement look. But you can also make it finer and more elegant if you, for instance, use a thinner wire. Now if you like to make your own jewellery, please feel free to check out my channel. I have loads of tutorials within many different mediums. Also loads more wire Kumihimo, where you can of course also check out my book. Otherwise, I really hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching it, and I'll see you in the next one.